If you want to understand the cultural weight of Super Silver Haze and G13, you cannot start with the buds themselves. You have to start with the environments that produced them, the worlds that gave them meaning. Cannabis has always been more than a plant. It is a mirror for the laws, the myths, and the human behaviors surrounding it. In the 1990s, two very different landscapes were shaping what cannabis meant to the people who consumed it. On one side of the Atlantic stood Amsterdam, a city glowing with coffee shops, competitions, and a strange kind of semi-legality that allowed cannabis to be displayed like a commodity even while much of the world still criminalized it. On the other side stood Prohibition-era America, where cannabis was hidden in basements and whispered about in coded language, where stories carried more weight than proof. Out of Amsterdam came Super Silver Haze, a champion of visibility, paraded and celebrated. Out of America came G13, a strain wrapped in secrecy and rumor, known more for its story than for anything a grower could write down. Amsterdam in the 1990s was not just a backdrop, it was a stage. Tourists flew in from London, New York, Berlin, Sydney, and Tokyo, and the first place many of them went was a coffee shop. The rooms were filled with the haze of smoke, the clink of glass, and menus written in bold black letters dividing strains into two categories, Sativa and Indica. These menus were not scientific documents. They were psychological scripts. They told consumers what to expect before the joint was even lit. If you ordered something from the Sativa column, you were primed for clarity, creativity, and energy. If you picked from the Indica column, you braced yourself for heaviness, body comfort, and quiet. These categories were simple, easy to understand, and endlessly repeated, which made them feel true. When the High Times Cannabis Cup arrived each year, the city itself seemed to validate those categories. Judges announced winners, photographers captured the moment, and suddenly, a strain was not just a plant, but a global headline. Super Silver Haze was bred for this stage. It was not the product of accident or chance. It was assembled by breeders like Neville Schoenmakers and Shanti Baba, men who already knew the weight that names and reputations carried. They took three of the most influential cultivars of the era, Skunk Hash 1, Northern Lights, and Haze, and combined them into a single plant designed to dominate. And it did. In 1997, 1998, and 1999, Super Silver Haze claimed first place at the Cannabis Cup. Those victories did more than crown a champion. They turned the plant into the definition of sativa for an entire generation of smokers. People walked into coffee shops, asked for it by name, and carried the memory home to their own countries. Its effect may have varied, its chemistry may have shifted from cut to cut, but its cultural role was solidified. It was the plant that proved the sativa story to be real, even though its own lineage was hybrid at the core. Now, turn to America, and the atmosphere could not have been more different. In the same decade that Amsterdam was exporting cannabis culture with menus and trophies, the United States was still deep in prohibition. Cannabis here was not displayed. It was hidden. Growers worked in secrecy, often in rural barns or suburban basements. Conversations about strains were carried out in whispers, and names passed like passwords from one trusted person to another. In this world, myth was as powerful as any fact, because proof was dangerous to hold. The less written down, the safer you were. Out of this climate of rumor came the story of G13. The tale went that G13 was bred in a government laboratory, a secret project carried out at a facility like the University of Mississippi or perhaps a research station in Kentucky. It was said to be the ultimate indica, engineered for strength, too powerful for the public, hidden away until a single cutting was smuggled out by a rogue technician. Whether this happened or not was almost beside the point. What mattered was how the story spread. In an era of criminalization, where magazines hinted at strains, but growers lived under constant threat, the idea that the government had secretly bred a super indica carried weight. To smoke G13 was not just to consume cannabis. It was to participate in a story of secrecy, rebellion, and access to something forbidden. Proof was impossible, but belief was everything. Side by side, Super Silver Haze and G13 represent two worlds in collision. One was born under bright lights, celebrated by judges and photographers, its reputation cemented by menus and trophies. The other was born in rumor, carried from mouth to mouth, its reputation built on secrecy and myth. Amsterdam rewarded visibility. America rewarded secrecy. Both plants became more than cultivars. They became cultural signals, shaping how consumers thought about cannabis itself. And in that contrast, polished champion versus whispered legend, the foundation for their supposed opposition, Sativa versus Indica, was laid in the minds of the people who carried those stories forward. Lineage is the quiet thread that runs beneath every cannabis story. For Super Silver Haze, that thread is anything but simple. When most people hear the name, they imagine a single plant, maybe even a pure expression of something called sativa. But Super Silver Haze was never a single expression. It was the deliberate merging of three of the most influential bloodlines of the late 20th century: Skunk Hash 1, Northern Lights, and Haze. To understand why this combination mattered, you have to slow down and see what each ancestor carried with it, not just in terms of genetics, but in terms of reputation and cultural meaning. Skunk Hash 1 was already a global landmark by the time Super Silver Haze was assembled. Its roots stretched across continents, blending Afghani, Colombian gold, and Acapulco gold. This was not a landrace pulled whole from the earth. It was one of the first truly stabilized hybrids, and it set a precedent for what modern breeding would look like. Growers loved it because it performed predictably, flowering in uniform cycles, delivering pungent yields that could be relied upon. Consumers recognized it by its sharp, unmistakable aroma, often described as animalic, almost too strong to ignore. Skunk Hash 1 was not just a plant. It was a statement about control, about hybridization as a tool to master unpredictability. When it became part of Super Silver Haze, it contributed more than just genes. It contributed the cultural reputation of stability and potency. Northern Lights brought a different inheritance. Born in the Pacific Northwest, it was an Afghani-dominant plant that migrated to Europe and became a backbone for indoor cultivation. Growers praised it because it was compact, resinous, and fast to flower. Where haze plants stretched tall and tested patience with long cycles, Northern Lights kept itself short, heavy, and efficient. It became the plant that fit Prohibition-era grow rooms, where space was tight and risk demanded speed. By the time it entered the lineage of Super Silver Haze, it had already become an archetype for indica in the public imagination, a symbol of body-heavy resin production. When folded into the Super Silver Haze blend, it tempered the wildness of haze, thickened the resin, and anchored the plant in something denser. And then there was haze itself, the chaotic ancestor, the unpredictable flame that burned too long for most growers to tolerate. Haze had come out of California, built from South American, Thai, and South Indian landraces, strung together by experimental breeders who valued effect over efficiency. It was a plant that could stretch for months before flowering finished, a test of patience that rewarded persistence with complexity. Smokers described it as electric, cerebral, sometimes overwhelming, and its terpene profiles leaned toward the rare, terpinoline, pinene, bright aromatics that stood apart from the musky Afghanis dominating most indoor grows. Haze was never easy, but it was mythic. To fold it into Super Silver Haze was to harness chaos, to bring the legend of haze into a form that could win competitions and be sold by the gram. Put together, these three parents created more than a hybrid. They created a performance. Super Silver Haze could be displayed as a sativa while carrying skunk reliability, Northern Lights density, and haze uplift. It was not pure. It was an engineered myth, a hybrid dressed in the clothes of a category. The breeders knew that, the judges may have known it too, but the consumers rarely saw past the label. They took the plant at face value, as a pure expression of sativa, when its very DNA was a contradiction. G13's Lineage is the opposite of this. Where Super Silver Haze was documented, entered into competitions, and tied to breeder names, G13's ancestry is marked by silence. No breeder's notes, no catalog entries, no genetic map. Its story is instead carried by rumor, and that absence of documentation became part of its identity. The whispers say Afghanica dominance, heavy with broad-leafed genes that brought density and short flowering. Some suggest skunk influence slipped in as the plant passed through American basements, its pungency hinting at hybrid reinforcement. But the truth is, no one can confirm it. G13's lineage is folklore. It exists in the stories told around it more than in the plant itself. This obscurity is not accidental. In Prohibition-era America, secrecy was survival. Breeders and growers did not write down their crosses because to do so was to leave evidence, and evidence was risk. Instead, they guarded knowledge in small circles, passing it on only to those they trusted. G13, whether real or embellished, fit this pattern perfectly. Its power came from the absence of detail. The less people knew, the more they believed. To say you had smoked G13 was to claim access to a secret, a plant that no one could fully trace. That secrecy was its lineage as much as its Afghanica roots. So the contrast between the two becomes sharper. Super Silver Haze's lineage was built in the open, a showpiece designed from 3 pillars of cannabis breeding, marketed and celebrated. G13's lineage was built in the shadows, shaped by rumor, cloaked in mystery, and carried by word of mouth. One was a hybrid engineered to fit a narrative of purity. The other was an enigma whose very lack of clarity gave it power. Both show us that lineage in cannabis is never just about parent plants. It is also about the cultural conditions that decide whether history is written down or erased, whether names are marketed or whispered, whether knowledge is displayed or hidden. Lineage does not live only in the grow room or the genetic map. Lineage lives in the way people talk about a plant, in the meanings that attach themselves to a name. When Super Silver Haze emerged from Amsterdam, its ancestry was already hybrid and complicated. Skunk, Northern Lights, Haze. That combination could have been presented as messy, contradictory, a tangle of influences. Instead, it was displayed on a coffee shop menu as if it were the embodiment of a single word, sativa. The contradiction was erased, and in its place stood a narrative that was easy to sell, easy to believe, and easy to repeat. People did not walk away from Amsterdam talking about terpenoline dominance or Afghani bass notes. They walked away saying, "I smoked Super Silver Haze, and it was a pure sativa." The lineage shaped the culture not because of what it contained, but because of what it allowed people to believe. In those years, Amsterdam had become more than a city. It was a classroom where cannabis tourists learned how to think about the plant. The menus acted as blackboards, dividing cannabis into sativa and indica columns. The judges at the Cannabis Cup acted as lecturers, declaring winners, reinforcing categories, and stamping credibility onto the names. When Super Silver Haze won 3 years in a row, it was not just another hybrid with an impressive yield. It became a global ambassador for the idea that cannabis could be cleanly divided, that sativa was real, and that if you wanted proof, you only had to look at the champion. For many travelers, this was their first exposure to cannabis outside of prohibition secrecy, and first impressions carry deep psychological weight. Super Silver Haze's lineage mattered because it was hidden beneath the costume of sativa, and that costume became part of cannabis culture worldwide. Now look at G13, and the cultural impact takes a very different shape. Here was a strain whose lineage was obscure, maybe even fabricated, and yet it became one of the most powerful names in the underground. Why? Because Prohibition America did not have menus or competitions to guide perception. It had rumors, passed hand to hand, like contraband. In that atmosphere, mystery itself was currency. The less you knew about a strain, the more it seemed worth knowing. G13 fit this need perfectly. Its supposed origin in a government laboratory tapped into real suspicions about surveillance, secrecy, and control. The idea that a plant could be engineered by the very institutions trying to suppress cannabis gave it an aura of rebellion. To say you had smoked G13 was not just to claim an experience. It was to place yourself inside a story that resisted authority. The lineage of G13, half true or not at all true, became part of a shared cultural myth that bonded smokers in the shadows. This is why the lineages of these two strains matter so deeply to cannabis culture. Super Silver Haze, with its documented hybrid parentage, taught people to accept the illusion of purity. It showed that hybrids could wear the mask of sativa and be accepted as such if the culture around them repeated the story often enough. G13, with its undocumented origins, taught people to value secrecy as authenticity. It proved that a name could hold power even when no one could trace its ancestry. Together, they created a split in cannabis literacy that still lingers. On one side, a polished narrative that confirmed the categories consumers wanted. On the other hand, a shadowy legend thrived because categories could not be confirmed. The weight of this contrast is not historical trivia. It is the foundation of how cannabis is still understood today. Menus continue to divide plants into sativa and indica, even as science dismantles those labels. Myths continue to circulate about hidden genetics and stolen cuts, even as genetic testing offers clarity. The culture remembers the stories more than the chemistry, because stories are easier to carry, easier to tell, and easier to believe. Super Silver Haze and G13 mattered not just for what they were, but for what they taught consumers to expect. And those expectations have shaped every conversation about cannabis since. When we move from lineage into chemistry, the conversation shifts from stories to signals. Lineage tells us what plants were brought together, but chemistry shows us how those plants express themselves in real time. The difficulty is that chemistry never plays out in the simple binaries of sativa or indica. It shifts, it varies, it leans one way and then another depending on cut, environment, and cultivation. To understand Super Silver Haze and G13 through chemistry is to recognize that each one carried multiple possible identities, some that matched the myth and some that broke it completely. Begin with Super Silver Haze. At the top of its profile sits terpinolene, a terpene so unusual in cannabis that its presence alone feels distinctive. Terpinolene is not dominant in most cultivars, which is part of why people noticed something different when they encountered SSH. In aroma, it can register as floral, citrusy, sometimes herbal, and almost reminiscent of fresh-cut wood. But what mattered more than the smell was how people interpreted the feeling. In Amsterdam coffee shops, consumers are already primed for the idea of sativa inhaled terpinolene and translated it as energy, uplift, and creativity. The chemistry and the cultural script aligned, reinforcing each other. Yet, terpinolene can also be subtle, and when muted by other compounds, its brightness may fade. That variability never fit neatly into the category of sativa, but menus told people otherwise, and expectations smoothed over the inconsistencies. Next is pinene, another prominent SSH terpene known for its sharp pine resin character. Pinene is often associated with clarity, alertness, and even the sensation of open breathing. In SSH, pinene reinforced the narrative that this was a cerebral plant, one to smoke in the daytime, one that felt clean rather than heavy. Again, chemistry fed directly into culture, or perhaps more accurately, culture cherry-picked chemistry that confirmed its myth. If SSH cut leaned heavily into pinene, consumers celebrated it as proof of sativa's clear head. But pinene does not always dominate. Sometimes it played a secondary role, shifting the overall experience without fully defining it. Those subtleties rarely made it into conversation. Below these brighter notes came caryophyllene, inherited from skunk hash 1. Caryophyllene adds a deep peppery spice, an earthy backbone that consumers often overlooked because it didn't match the headline narrative. Yet, caryophyllene grounds a strain, adding weight to the aroma and often giving the plant a sense of presence that lingers. In SSH, it was the quiet stabilizer, balancing the flightier terpenes, reminding anyone who looked closely that this plant was not pure haze, not pure sativa, but a layered hybrid. And then there was myrcene, carried most strongly from northern lights. Myrcene is one of the most common terpenes in cannabis, with its musky, herbal, sometimes fruity undertones. In consumer culture, it became linked, fairly or unfairly, with heaviness, with the couch lock experience. When SSH expressed higher myrcene, it undercut the soaring brightness promised by the menus. Some smokers felt energized, others felt slowed, and the contradiction lived side by side in the same name. This is where literacy and expectation collided most clearly. The chemistry told one story, the category told another, and consumers had to reconcile the difference. Many didn't notice. The myth shaped the memory more than the compound. Turning to G13, we see a different pattern, but the same lesson. Its reputation was built on heaviness, and its chemistry often confirmed that with strong myrcene dominance. The musky, earthy undertone of myrcene fits the story of the ultimate indica. People inhaled it and felt what they expected to feel, a sinking weight, a body-led experience, whether the chemistry fully delivered or not. Alongside myrcene came caryophyllene, giving G13 that peppered depth, a sense of density that reinforced its reputation for strength. Together, these two terpenes aligned with the myth of indica, and prohibition culture held on to them as proof. But G13 was not chemically static. Certain cuts revealed unexpected surges of pinene or limonene. Pinene, again, brings clarity and sharpness, something that could break the illusion of uniform heaviness. Limonene, with its citrus brightness, carries a cultural association with lightness, sometimes even laughter. In Prohibition America, without terpene literacy, these differences were confusing. One smoker could swear G13 was crushingly heavy, while another found it surprisingly clear. Instead of acknowledging variability, the myth won out. People explained away contradictions by doubling down on the story. It was the government's indica. It was designed to be strong, and that was that. The chemistry was there, but the myth was louder. Beyond terpenes, both SSH and G13 carried cannabinoid complexity that was rarely discussed. THC was the headline, but it was not the whole picture. Small presences of CBG, CBC, and even trace amounts of THCV or CBD surfaced, depending on the cut. These minor cannabinoids did not dominate, but they added nuance, shaping effects in ways consumers could feel even if they lacked the language to name them. Prohibition-era labs rarely tested for them, and coffee shop menus did not mention them. Yet they were part of the spectrum that defined how the plant expressed itself. The truth was always more complicated than the numbers that made it onto labels. When you place Super Silver Haze and G13 side by side, their chemistry makes the myth of sativa and indica impossible to defend. SSH, the champion sativa, carried myrcene heaviness and hybrid grounding alongside its brighter terpenes. G13, the legendary indica, could lean unexpectedly into pinene or limonene, breaking its own stereotype. Both carried minor cannabinoids that went unmentioned but mattered. Both shifted across cuts and environments. The chemistry does not speak in binaries. It speaks in layers, balances, and ranges. The myth of sativa and indica was not built on this complexity. It was built on the cultural need to simplify it. Cannabis literacy begins where the stories end and the plant itself begins. With Super Silver Haze and G13, literacy means learning how to read past the names, past the categories, past the rumors, and into what the plant is actually expressing. These two cultivars teach us not just about themselves, but about the gap that exists between what culture tells us and what chemistry reveals. That gap is where literacy has to grow. Take Super Silver Haze. On a menu, it appeared under sativa, and for decades that was enough to define it. Consumers saw the word, carried an expectation, and shaped their experiences around it. But literacy demands something deeper. To read Super Silver Haze as a literate consumer or bud tender is to see the fingerprints of its lineage. To know that terpinolene and pinene often surface here, that caryophyllene and myrcene can change the texture of the high, and that variability across cuts is not failure but nature. It is to recognize that the sativa story is a cultural shorthand, while the reality is a hybrid with shifting balances. Literacy is the ability to hold both truths at once, the story people carry into the shop and the chemistry that underlies it. Now look at G13. Its literacy is trickier because it has always thrived in the absence of information. To most, G13 was the government indica, and that label was enough to cement belief. But literacy does not stop at belief. It asks, what are the terpenes? What does the lab show? How do pinene or limonene alter the experience when they appear? Literacy is the refusal to accept secrecy as identity. It is the recognition that G13 is not a monolith, but a variable plant, just as subject to the environment and cut as any other. To read G13 literately is to acknowledge its myth while still listening to its chemistry. For bud tenders, literacy means more than memorizing menus. It means guiding consumers away from the illusion of certainty without stripping away the stories that give cannabis culture its richness. A literate bud tender can explain that Super Silver Haze is famous as a sativa, but is actually a hybrid whose effect depends on which compounds dominate. They can acknowledge the legend of G13 while pointing out that no single terpene profile defines it. Literacy is not about telling consumers they are wrong. It is about giving them tools to see the plant more clearly than the categories allow. For consumers, literacy means asking better questions. Not, is this sativa or indica, but what are the dominant terpenes? How is this grown? What does the lab say about its full spectrum? It means recognizing that two jars labeled Super Silver Haze may not feel identical because the balance of terpinolene and myrcene can shift. It means understanding that G13's government story is part of cannabis folklore, but the real plant is written in its chemistry, not in rumor. Cannabis literacy is not about rejecting culture, it is about expanding it. The stories of Super Silver Haze and G13 will always matter because they carry history and identity. But literacy requires that we go further, that we train ourselves to see the plant as both story and science. Only then can cannabis be understood for what it truly is, not a set of rigid categories, but a living spectrum of compounds shaped by lineage, cultivation, and environment, translated through culture and interpreted by the human mind. The myth of indica and sativa is not just a misunderstanding of science. It is a cultural system that was built, repeated, and reinforced until it became the framework through which almost everyone thought about cannabis. Super Silver Haze and G13 sit at the center of that system. Both strains carried hybrid complexity, both contradicted the categories they were used to prove, and yet both became symbols of the myth. To understand why the myth endures, we have to walk through how it was constructed, why it appealed to people, and how it became embedded so deeply that even today it shapes dispensary menus and consumer expectations. Begin with Amsterdam. The coffee shop era of the 1980s and 1990s gave cannabis its first global stage. For the first time, consumers from around the world could walk into a public space, open a menu, and see cannabis presented as if it were wine or beer. But unlike wine, there was no established language of terroir, no system of vintages or varietals. What Amsterdam offered instead was a binary, sativa on one side of the menu, indica on the other. These words were borrowed from botany, where they once described differences in plant morphology, narrow leaves, tall stature, and long flowering for tropical landraces labeled sativa, broad leaves, short stature, and fast flowering for highland Afghanicus labeled indica. But those botanical descriptors were never meant to define effect. The coffee shops transformed them into consumer categories. Sativa meant uplifting, creative, cerebral. Indica meant heavy, sedating, physical. The binary was simple, intuitive, and easy to teach. It spread quickly because it reduced a complex plant into two predictable experiences. Super Silver Haze became the perfect champion for this system. It was already a hybrid, but its brighter terpenes like terpinolene and pinene aligned with the cultural story of sativa. When it won 3 consecutive cannabis cups, the victories were framed not as proof of hybrid variability, but as confirmation that sativa was real. Judges crowned it, magazines reported it, tourists carried the story home. In that moment, chemistry and lineage were overshadowed by category. SSH was declared a sativa, and that declaration became fact in the minds of millions. The contradiction that its parentage included northern lights, a symbol of indica, was ignored. Myth overruled complexity. Now turned to Prohibition-era America. There were no menus, no competitions, no trophies. But the myth of opposites was still taking hold. Consumers wanted a language to describe differences, and in the absence of science, rumors filled the void. G13 entered this climate like a legend. Supposedly bred in a secret government lab, supposedly smuggled out by a rogue technician, supposedly the strongest indica ever created. Its power lay not in proof, but in secrecy. People accepted the story because it gave them something to hold on to. If Amsterdam had the soaring sativas, America had the crushing indica. G13 embodied that narrative, even though its chemistry, like SSH's, varied across cuts and conditions. The myth was not weakened by contradiction. It was strengthened by it, because contradiction could be explained away as different phenos, while the category itself remained untouchable. What made the myth durable was not accuracy, but simplicity. Humans are drawn to binaries because they make the world easier to navigate, day and night, hot and cold, male and female. Cannabis was folded into this same psychological pattern, one plant to lift you up, another to slow you down. Consumers repeated the terms because they gave them certainty. Bud tenders used them because they made sales easier. Coffee shops and dispensaries built menus around them because they were easy to print. The myth survived not because it reflected reality, but because it met a cultural need for order in a space of chaos. But myths do not remain harmless when they are repeated long enough. They shape structures. By the 2000s, dispensaries in the United States were adopting the same binary menus as Amsterdam. Products were color-coded, red or purple for indica, green for sativa, and yellow for hybrid. Marketing campaigns echoed the division, promising daytime highs versus nighttime relaxers. Regulators even repeated the categories in their own language, embedding indica and sativa into licensing documents and official communications, as if they were scientific truth. What began as cultural shorthand hardened into an institutional framework. And once institutions repeat a myth, it becomes even harder to dismantle. Super Silver Haze and G13 both reveal how this happened. SSH, a hybrid dressed as sativa, showed how easily a plant could be placed in a category if it won enough trophies. G13, a plant defined by rumor, showed how secrecy and story could create the illusion of a category even without proof. Both strains became pillars in the binary that divided cannabis culture, even as their own chemistry betrayed the lie. Consumers experienced variability but explained it away. Bud tenders encountered contradictions but relied on the script. The myth endured not because it was true, but because it was useful. Today, the persistence of these categories continues to mislead. A consumer buys a so-called sativa expecting energy, only to find themselves heavy-lidded from myrcene. Another buys an indica expecting sedation, only to feel unexpectedly alert from pinene. The myth sets expectations that the chemistry cannot always meet. When reality contradicts the label, consumers feel confused, disappointed, or misled. Trust erodes, not because cannabis fails, but because the category's overpromised. And still, the words remain on menus. Still the labels are printed. Still the industry clings to a binary that has already been dismantled by science. The truth is that cannabis does not live in two boxes. It lives in spectra, in shifting balances of terpenes and cannabinoids, in cuts and phenotypes and environments. The myth of indica and sativa was never about biology. It was about psychology, commerce, and culture. Super Silver Haze and G13 stand as proof of this. They are not opposites in any real sense. They are mirrors, each reflecting how humans have imposed categories on a plant too complex to be contained by them. And in seeing that, literacy becomes not just valuable, but necessary. Super Silver Haze and G13 will always be remembered as more than plants. They became symbols, one born into the spotlight of Amsterdam, the other carried in whispers across Prohibition America. Both wore costumes that didn't quite fit. One was hailed as the ultimate sativa despite hybrid blood, the other cemented as the ultimate indica despite unclear lineage. They remind us that cannabis culture has always needed stories, and that those stories often outweighed the chemistry. But they also remind us of something more urgent, that myths are only as strong as the literacy that surrounds them. Cannabis literacy is the bridge between what people are told and what the plant actually is. When consumers hear sativa or indica, they are hearing echoes of Amsterdam menus and American rumors, not chemistry. When a budtender repeats those words without explanation, they are passing down scripts, not science. Literacy asks us to step past those scripts and see cannabis as it expresses itself through terpenes, cannabinoids, environment, and history. It asks us to read the plant with patience, to acknowledge the myths without being bound by them, to carry the culture forward without repeating its errors. Super Silver Haze shows us that even a plant designed to win competitions cannot be reduced to a single category. Its terpenoline brightness, its pinnin sharpness, its caryophyllene depth, its myrcene weight, these are not the attributes of a pure sativa, but of a complex hybrid that changes from cut to cut. G13 shows us that even the most mythic indica cannot escape variation. Its myrcene-heavy expressions confirmed the legend, but its pinene and limonene expressions betrayed it, revealing that even a supposed government superstrain could never be fixed in one box. Together, they teach us that cannabis is not about absolutes. And literacy is not just an academic exercise, it is the foundation of trust. When a consumer enters a dispensary and is told that an indica will sedate them or a sativa will energize them, and the plant fails to match, trust erodes. When consumers are told instead that chemistry varies, that terpenes and cannabinoids matter more than categories, and that their own expectations will shape their experience, trust is rebuilt. Literacy does not promise certainty, it promises honesty. And in an industry where myth has often been louder than truth, honesty is what will carry cannabis forward. Super Silver Haze and G13 are case studies, but they are also warnings. They show us what happens when culture simplifies complexity into categories, and they show us how those categories become myths that endure far beyond their usefulness. They also show us the way out. By moving beyond indica and sativa, by training ourselves and our communities to speak in terms of chemistry, lineage, and context, we can honor the past without being trapped by it. We can carry the heritage of coffee shops and prohibition legends while teaching a clearer literacy to the next generation. That is how cannabis moves from myth to clarity, from rumor to knowledge. If you've stayed with us through this journey, thank you for investing your attention. Cannabis deserves this level of care, not just as a product, but as a cultural force that has shaped and been shaped by human history. If you found value in this episode, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who still wrestle with the old question, sativa or indica. Every share helps push literacy forward, and every conversation brings us closer to seeing the plant as it truly is. This video is intended solely for educational and historical purposes. It does not provide medical advice, make health claims, or encourage unlawful activity. Viewers should always follow the laws and regulations of their jurisdiction regarding cannabis use, possession, and cultivation.